China has unveiled plans to cut its emissions by 7 to 10% over the next 10 years. President Xi Jinping announced the goal via video at the UN Climate Summit, where the US was absent. President Xi's message was a big contrast to Donald Trump, whom just a day earlier called climate change a con job, while doubling down on the use of fossil fuels.
绿色低碳转型是时代潮流。 尽管个别国家逆流而动，但国际社会应当把握正确方向，坚持信心不动摇，行动不停止，力度不减弱，推动制定和实施国家自主贡献，为全球气候治理合作 注入更多正能量。
Now, China's pledge to reduce carbon emissions is said to be a first by the world's top polluter. Beijing's vow is backed by its commitment to expand wind and solar power by 6 times over 2020 levels, drastically expand forests, as well as ramp up the production of electric vehicles. Well, for more insights, let's bring in Yao Zhe, Global Policy Advisor with Greenpeace East Asia. Well, thanks, Ms. Yao, for joining us today. So we have it there, China pledging to cut emissions by up to 10% by 2035. And I'm curious to know, how do you read into this commitment? Because critics are arguing that the world's biggest economies are still not doing enough to match the urgency of the climate crisis.
I think we have to see the target in 2 ways. China is the world's largest carbon emitters on an annual basis, but at the same time, it is also the biggest clean technology provider. So what China has to offer matters a lot. That also means China is facing very high expectations given the urgency of climate action. So the announcement yesterday happened in the context that the US federal government is temporarily absent from global efforts. China's announcement was a positive signal, signaling that China will continue to contribute in this global fight against climate change. But to your question, I personally also think China can do more. The target is only a baseline. It's only the floor, and China's domestic decarbonization progress, driven by its robust development on wind and solar and EVs, can actually enable more emissions reductions. So I'm hopeful that the actual progress will in fact outpace the target on paper.
That's right. Beijing pushing hard on renewables, as you've mentioned, that they have said that the plan is to increase, right, wind and solar power 6-fold, in the next decade. But what do you foresee some of the obstacles that could stand in the way of them achieving that?
If we are talking about the renewable target, the biggest barrier is the grid. China has no problem producing, manufacturing such amount of equipment to be added. But the problem is whether the grid can absorb all this renewable energy that's being produced in addition to what already had now. So that's why the climate and energy communities in China have been increasingly working to address this grid issue. Then if we are talking about the emission reduction target, I think the biggest challenge and also uncertainty is the speed of China's economic growth. We are seeing currently a rather conservative target, up to 10%, precisely because of that uncertainty. In a way, policymakers are trying to find a balance between decarbonization and saving some leeways for future economic stimulus. So that's an uncertainty we have to bear in mind.
Also, President Xi, he's kind of like singled out developed nations, right, to take the lead on stronger climate action. But given China's position as both the world's largest current emitter and also a country that still identifies as developing, how should we understand what he's trying to say here?
My interpretation is that in the global effort to address climate change, every country now takes a part. Every country has a share to contribute. But how much and what exactly the share of the responsibility for different nations or regions, that depends. Each region, each government might have its own views. For China, because China developed rather later in terms of the historic stage, and the EU and the US are the major emitters on a historic basis. That's why Beijing's view is that developed countries should still take the lead. That's a principle I think we shouldn't abandon, but bear in mind that the world is rapidly changing. The economic structure, the economic reality is also changing. As I mentioned, clean energy development in China is taking place at the speed that no one had expected. So that means China's role will be very unique.
That's right. And all of this building towards the next big climate summit, which is COP30 in Brazil. What would you personally, Ms. Yao, like to see in China's approach, in these other top emitters' approach, that would basically convince everyone else that it is ready to take on a stronger leadership role in fighting climate change?
I think two things. For China, one very practical step forward is that how China can contribute to the global renewable energy vision that countries made 2 or 3 years ago about tripling the renewable energy installations by 2030. Time is getting closer, but investments are still lacking. China is very well positioned to contribute more to that effort. Then secondly, I think jointly with other nations, after yesterday's UN climate summit, we have to be honest that there is a gap between what countries collectively have committed to and what's needed in terms of fulfilling the Paris Agreement target. So this is the gap that needs to be addressed at COP30 collectively as well. The presidency and other diplomatic efforts need to find some solutions that allow different governments and policymakers to enhance their target, which also signal confidence to the outside world.
Sure. So more investments and more action beyond just making these pledges. Thank you so very much, Yao Zhe, Global Policy Advisor with Greenpeace East Asia.